Well, it's interesting that we're here, David, because it seems to me that you represent a traditional point of view about religion. And this book represents what might be something quite new on the scene, what's been called a new dispensation, a new way in which divine grace emerges into the world. I think it's a little early to tell if that's true, but it's rather fascinating that we're here like this.
Well, actually, when you said a new way in which divine grace moves into the world, that expresses exactly my problem with the way that religion is used by Jung from time to time. And that is that, as you may know, those of you who've read this or Jung's other works, he takes external religious symbols and ideas and makes them components of the psyche, or assumes that they are, doesn't make them, but assumes that they are components of the psyche. But part of, if you read him from time to time, the symbols of religion are so powerful and so evocative that you could often mistake him for describing things as though they are in fact forces in the world. And I think that he uses that to sort of gin up the power of his writing, and then when gets called on it, he says, no, 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 I'm only talking about the psyche. But there is this sort of back and forth movement that is the first problem that I have with the way Jung treats.
Well, maybe we should start there.
Let's start with that, okay. I've got one other, I don't want to forget.
No, that's all right, but that'll take us till about next Tuesday. I think that you sound like Martin Buber. Which
I take that as a compliment.
I'm sure you would. Yeah. One of Buber's many critiques of Jung was that he accused Jung of what was called psychologism, which meant that you could reduce a transcendent divinity to something that was, quotes, only psychological, as if that meant it wasn't real. And so, but Jung's big point is that the sacred or the holy manifests itself by means of the psyche. That's the first point. And he said, I'm not responsible for that, it just does that. I'm just pointing it out to you guys. So that a religious experience is willy-nilly a psychological experience. And the second point is that the psyche is real. It's a real domain, and it's so that when you say that something is psychological, you don't mean that it doesn't exist, the way you'd say it was only a dream. But on the contrary, you mean, if you say it's psychological, that it does exist, because the psyche is real. So that to say religious experience might arise, for example, from the unconscious, is not to say it's not real.
No, that's why I used external as opposed to real.
Well, this
because
is
the original religious claim was, what you are experiencing is something that is external to you, that you are now filtering through your psyche, as opposed to arising from within your psyche.
Well, this is another major point. He locates the divine deeply in human subjectivity.
Right. Well, that's my second problem.
And
you just
why on earth would that be a problem? I mean, then you wouldn't have to go to synagogues, temples.
That's my third problem.
I didn't mean to cost you your job.
I was going to leave membership forms outside, and now...
Okay. It's a waste of money, believe me.
I would actually be curious to know, when I read this...
Yeah. You read this?
Much of it. When I looked at it, when I saw it sitting there on my coffee table,
you took it to the beach,
and thought one day I will read this. Yeah. It feels very much, and this is no surprise because it's acknowledged in the introduction and elsewhere, like Nietzsche's "Thus Spoke Zarathustra," in the sense that it's the proclamation of man as a divine being. And this is my second problem, is this is an unfortunate legacy that I think Jung has left the New Age movement, which is it uses the language of God, who is by definition something infinitely greater than human beings, wiser than human beings, and just appropriates it for us. And the idea of, one second, the idea of divinity inside us, I just want to say, gives us much more credit than most of the people I know, myself included, deserve.
Well, it can be there without you being in touch with it. The fact that you're not in touch with it doesn't mean it's not there.
Well,
is that an unfortunate...
But that means that there are people who, in fact, manifest the divine in the world, and all I can say is everybody that I know or have read about, including, by the way, Jung, clearly, is a swampy cauldron of different drives, some of them better, some of them worse. Some actions exalted, some actions, as in Jung's case, very debased. And just to call them divine makes us feel good, but doesn't actually make us any better.
Well,
I have a fan.
Just hang on a minute. Just hang on a minute.
You're divine, whoever you are.
There are 2 points here. One is whether God is truly wholly other, with a capital O, as it were.
Right.
Which I think what you were suggesting, and I think Jung would say God is not wholly other, that's a mistake. That somehow the divine and the human are intrinsically related in a way reminiscent of the Upanishadic "thou art that." Okay, now you may not agree with that, but that's a very ancient philosophy that antedates Jung. And the New Age movement is, although I agree it's very superficial and often silly, it's actually rooted in that kind of spirituality. Right. If it could just be tuned up slightly, it might be actually quite
it depends. A lot of this might be...
There's another important
go ahead.
point, before I forget, which is all the swampy stuff that you eloquently referred to. Why would that not be part of the divine also? One of Jung's big points, not here so much, although somewhat actually in here, is that the divine has a light side and the dark side, especially in Christianity, not so much in Judaism, but the Christians have tried to make the divine only light, and in him there is no darkness, one of the letters of John. In the Hebrew Bible, he's a little bit more problematic. Isaiah and people, Amos, acknowledge that he causes trouble, but what Jung wants to do is say that the divine has a light side and a dark side, and that we shouldn't load off the dark side into the figure of the Antichrist as if the divine has nothing to do with it. I mean, ever since Job, we've known that doesn't work.
That's, in answer to Job.
Are you still clapping, by the way?
Right. In answer to Job, he makes very clear, and I think that it's a fair reading, that clearly in the Hebrew Bible, I won't speak for the New Testament, God has a dark side. Even, as you said in Isaiah, God says, I create light and create evil.
And Amos says, would evil befall the city lest the Lord wills it?
I'm going to guess that they actually didn't think that they would come to people quoting scripture at each other. So this is an added benefit that you can... having said that, though, it just seems to me that the appropriation of religious language or divine language applied to human beings, it's partly semantic because it says at the beginning of the Bible that human beings are created in God's image. So if you want to say that in some way God works through us, that, I think, classical Western religion has no problem with. If you want to say we are God, that's exactly what I understand the Jewish tradition to have come into the world to repudiate, which is the idea that human beings are God. They say, no, actually, you're human beings. And for people who feel as though it's a wonderful thing for human beings to be God, it seems to me they devalue what it is to be a human being.
Yeah, well, it depends what you mean when you say that that human beings are God. Obviously not the ego or the empirical personnel. Obviously the me is not God. But that somehow we partake of that substance at some deeper level. I mean, obviously the ego is not divine. And that may be where all the difficult stuff that you're talking about. But I don't see why you want to take God off the hook. I mean, what about things like Hiroshima and the Holocaust?
Well,
why
actually, those are not what God's on the hook for. Those are what human beings are on the hook for. That's exactly the point. They're the ones. Well, look, human beings did that. If you want to put God on the hook, put God on the hook for disease, for earthquakes, for plagues. That's much harder. Natural evil is a much more difficult question for religious theologians than evil that comes of human free will. But we could spend a long time talking about that as well.
Well, I think we have a little time. But why don't we look at what happened to Job? I mean, what happens to Job is entirely with God's permission.
That's right.
God is just a gambler.
That's exactly.
Job is also Vegas, and that's what happened.
Job is right because Job asks the question of what about God created evil, not humanly created evil.
Well, at least it's with God's tacit approval that all these terrible things happen.
Even encouragement in Job, right? It's as you say, it's a result of a foolish wager that God does all these terrible things to Job.
Yeah. So that means that nothing else in the Bible can be trusted because you never know what else might be a wager. I mean,
or you could say it can be trusted because when it is a wager, the Bible tells you. So presumably the other stuff isn't, or the Bible would have let you know. But Let's look at an image.